As someone who keeps pretty up to date with fashion industry news, I've been noticing a disturbing pattern recently. Fashion brands finally promising accountability for all of their bad habits, only to snatch it away at the last second. I've noticed this happening not only from all levels of the fashion industry, but from players outside of the industry too. Governments and legislators all seem to be in on this rollback of promised change. And it's threatening the one thing people were pinning all of their hopes on to fix our broken fashion industry. Let me explain. Before we get into this, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Katie. I talk a lot about fashion sustainability, and if that's interesting to you, if you like this video, then make sure you subscribe and follow me on all of my other social medias. And with that, let's start to unpack this issue. Starting with luxury fashion's dodgy reform. So a little under a year ago, there were shockwaves throughout the fashion industry when Italian prosecutors linked the brand Armani to sweatshops on the outskirts of Milan. And only a few months later, Dior was also named in a similar scandal. And in doing so, opened up a wider investigation into labor abuses in luxury's supply chains, where underpaid and exploited Chinese workers working for an unauthorized subcontractor in luxury supply chains made handbags and leather accessories for major names. And I covered all of this in a video last year, diving into luxury's fast fashion-esque business model, where I specifically covered the media attention these scandals were getting at the time they broke, and made the point that although loads of people were acting shocked that this was happening in luxury's fashion supply chains, this had actually been happening for years, and we'd seen headlines come out in previous years detailing the exact same situation. Yet people seem to have forgotten, and it only became part of the conversation again when this investigation broke. So after Armani and Dior, the two big names, were put out into the media, further investigations were expected to follow, with around a dozen more brands expected to be named and looked into. But to date, no new cases have been filed. And recently, an Armani unit was released from supervision that they had been placed in with this investigation, after the brand allegedly satisfied officials looking into the case that they were taking necessary steps to alleviate these supply chain issues. But what I want to get into is what was said in the court documents for this investigation. The official paperwork describes a system of exploitation so entrenched and proven that it could be considered a part of a broader business policy exclusively aimed at increasing profit. That's what Milan's public prosecutor said in the official documents. And if you dig further into the findings, what the investigation found is indeed a system designed to give brands who are benefiting from this system plausible deniability. Interviews with some of the workers in these subcontracted factories show us that they are aware brands know what conditions they're working in, but are also okay with turning a blind eye. One worker who was interviewed said that they were briefed to tell inspectors that they only worked 4 hours a day, as their contract states they should be doing, but pointed out how unlikely this would have been to the inspectors, who would have been aware that the factory was making 1,300 bags a day with only 50 employees. That kind of quota can't be filled in that time frame. And the worker who was interviewed actually stated that he was working something closer to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Thankfully, this was called out by the investigation, and a quote from it says that even though Dior did not directly abuse workers, the mechanism of labor exploitation was culpably fueled by the brand. It's actually quite a big step for the investigation to lay the blame at the brand's door, but despite this, and despite the fact that the investigation concluded with the fact that this exploitation is deeply entrenched, as they put it, in brands' businesses, Armani was still released from supervision earlier than the 1-year timeframe initially agreed. And you have to ask, how is it believable that they have induced such widespread change in such short amount of time? Less than a year does not seem enough time to change a system that is deeply entrenched in exploitation. So much so that the investigation hinted that it was just part of the wider business policy. Even LVMH's investors, whose umbrella brand Dior sits under, publicly called on Bernard Arnault to better monitor how workers are treated within the brand, suggesting that people in charge are very aware that this exploitation runs further than one investigation. And yet, it seems to have been concluded in Armani's case. Some wider system change has been hinted at by governing bodies in Milan, who proposed a supply chain database, which in theory would create a new system where suppliers could upload all of their certifications and compliance schemes, and brands and auditors could have access to that. There are two glaring issues with this policy that's been put forward. One is that the draft of this scheme would be voluntary, so suppliers don't have to upload all of their compliance and certificates if they don't want to. And two is that it will be limited to the Lombardy region only, which is not where many of Milan's manufacturing hubs are located. Honestly, this is just one example that I'm going to list in this video of where change and reform was kind of dangled in front of our faces as a beacon of hope, only to be snatched away, as it seems like the investigation has resulted in almost no actual change. The fact that Armani got off with this after only a year, and that no new court cases have been filed, despite the fact that it was initially reported that a dozen other brands were being investigated, means that the only consequences for this entire thing is Armani and Dior having to deal with a light slap on the wrist, and the fashion industry moving on until a few years down the line when it comes out that these things are still happening and everyone acts re-shocked. Another example I want to give is the fact that recently we've been seeing a lot of legislative rollbacks, and this is a very worrying trend. I covered in a video recently that Vestiaire Collective had called out the French government for stalling legislation that promised to be legendary if passed. Vestiaire Collective blamed Shein for the stalling of the once unanimously celebrated fast fashion law that the French government introduced a year ago, saying that after Shein hired a former French minister known for his lobbying efforts on the government, all talk of the bill suddenly ceased, and that those two things weren't a coincidence. Whether this was a coincidence or not, it is true that France's fast fashion bill has yet to be passed, despite the fact that it had unanimous support when it was introduced in the lower form of government. And it's also very much a fact that Shein will benefit from this bill not being passed. Speaking of Shein, the UK also had the brand under a microscope when it investigated them in a parliamentary hearing earlier on this year, which I also covered on my channel. Despite how disastrously the hearing went, the UK has since failed to introduce any plans to publicly move against the brand, despite the fact that our MPs said they were horrified by the lack of information provided by Shein representatives when summoned to answer questions. And the statements they did provide gave lawmakers zero confidence in the integrity of Shein's supply chains. If this is really true, then why aren't we moving to introduce legislation like France's fast fashion bill to stop Shein being able to sell here, or at least penalize them for selling? How can a government investigation result in us being horrified by Shein's practices and also result in the leader of said investigation writing to the London Stock Exchange cautioning them not to allow the company to list, but not result in any other action? It just doesn't make sense. And it's not just the problem of specific countries rolling back on legislation either. The EU appears to have caved to corporate pressure, watering down sustainability reporting and due diligence requirements that were meant to hold companies accountable for their environmental and human rights impacts. Again, when it was introduced, this sustainability legislation gave a lot of people in the industry hope that we will begin to see real change. But after intense lobbying, the EU confirmed that this legislation had been delayed by years. Compliance deadlines have been pushed back, which gives companies up to 4 extra years before they have to start reporting, and sector-specific reporting has also been dropped, giving industries like fashion more freedom to obscure their labour practices. Obviously, this is really disappointing, but it is worth noting that the EU is making progress in some other areas, like the recent news that the extended producer responsibility laws are going through, which will make brands accountable for the waste that they create, finally. But that's just one aspect of the industry that is so broken that it needs complete legislative overhaul as soon as possible. My final example I want to put to you of fashion's increased dodging of responsibility is the worrying trend of greenwashing lawsuits that are being dismissed as quickly as they come. If brands were worried about the increasing amount of consumers suing fashion for greenwashing claims, then they don't need to be. H&M, Nike, and now Lululemon have all been taken to court over their murky sustainability claims, and all of those cases have been dismissed. In Nike's case, the court ruled that the greenwashing claims had insufficient evidence. Particularly, they failed to prove that the sustainability marketing was deceptive, or that the plaintiff had been misled at the time of purchase. A federal judge in Missouri also dismissed a case for insufficient evidence after it was failed to prove that H&M had misrepresented their products as sustainable or eco-friendly, and that H&M's clearly defined terms around things like more sustainable materials were sufficient in articulating sustainability. And in Lululemon's case, which accused the brand of misleading customers through their Be Planet messaging, and also alleging that customers paid a premium price for a product they thought was sustainable, the case was also dismissed, with the court saying that the case failed to adequately demonstrate the plaintiffs suffered financial harm or that Lululemon's marketing directly impacted the prices they made, despite the company's well-documented ethically dubious practices, which resulted in them marketing their leggings for hundreds of pounds under this Be Planet slogan. So now that we've uncovered this annoying trend of sustainability promises being snatched back from us, let's talk about why these setbacks are happening. For one thing, and probably most annoyingly, this influx of legislation that we're seeing from all different areas of the fashion industry, like wider legislation from groups like the EU or country-specific or even state-specific laws in the case of the US, is actually creating more issues than it's trying to solve. Despite the good intentions behind all of this legislation, the fact that they overlap so much with each other provides the perfect excuse for brands to say that it's all too complicated for them to comply with everything, and so they shouldn't comply with anything until it all gets sorted out. We also can't ignore fashion's age-old problem of uncertainty and lack of transparency in the industry. Brands have been hiding behind the unclear phrasing of certain key terms for years now, like a lack of legal parameters around what constitutes greenwashing that has allowed so many of these cases to be dismissed in court. They've also perfected the art of hiding behind phrases like fashion supply chains are too complex to map, which they've been using for years now, and despite the fact that technology has improved to the point where mapping supply chains is not such a big deal anymore, they continue to use as a way of shirking responsibility. As we saw with the France Shein legislation and the EU's recent setback on sustainability, we can't ignore the fact that fashion has a lot of funding and power to use to sway governing bodies when they want to. And I went into all the different facets of their power in that luxury fashion video I did last year, so watch that if you want to learn more. We also can't ignore another move in fashion's playbook, which is passing the responsibility and the cost of change off to consumers, to suppliers, rather than taking that on for themselves, whilst still monopolizing and increasing their profits. Another little move fashion loves is to hide behind changing political situations and point to short-term issues in order to shirk away from long-term investments, which sustainability often requires. And the most recent example of this I can think of is the tariff situation happening between the US and pretty much every other part of the world at this point. Vogue Business recently did an article talking about this, worrying about the idea that tariffs are taking up so much of fashion's attention that sustainability is going to be left in the dust as brands deprioritize it even further than they already do. And although this is just a recent example of what fashion has always done, it is quite worrying to think that this is going to happen even more as geopolitical tensions continue to rise. As I mentioned right at the beginning of the video, there's an issue going on here in the fact that legislation was for so long held up as the change the fashion industry needed to make a difference, to make an impact, to change these systems that have been exploiting others and exploiting our planet for so long. But as I detailed in the video, and as I've seen experts talking about recently, it's looking like we can no longer rely on legislation as we once thought we could for this change. And I'm not sure where that leaves us. If we can't rely on brands to take responsibility willingly, and we can't rely on governments to introduce legislation to make brands take responsibility, then how is it going to happen? Well, for one thing, we can embrace our power as consumers to demand change. As individuals, brands don't really care about what we think, as evidenced by all of those court cases that got dismissed. But as a collective, our power becomes a lot more worrying to them. We can all try boycotting, which is a rising trend that has actually been surprising people in how effective and easy it is. And I've seen people all over my social media saying that they were initially quite skeptical about how easy this would be, but actually there are so many alternatives that don't involve giving your money to major corporations. As one example, I've been boycotting Amazon this year, and actually with the exception of one purchase, which I very reluctantly had to make from them, I've managed to otherwise completely avoid using them for these 3 months of 2025. And really, it hasn't been as hard as I thought it would be. I just had to get over the expectation that things should be delivered so quickly and kind of plan for that a little bit, which is where I fell down in that one purchase I had to make for them. I didn't adequately plan enough time to receive something. But honestly, as I said, it's really not been that hard to avoid them. I've been prioritizing going down to my local high street and using local shops to find things if I need them in a hurry, or just practicing the art of being a little bit more patient. And I can confidently say that I think I could keep this going for many, many years. If this is something you're interested in trying, but you're a little bit unsure, then I would recommend just starting with one brand that you want to boycott, be it Zara, Shein, or Amazon. And I think you'll surprise yourself with how easy it is. Of course, we can also exercise our collective power in other ways, such as joining in with calls for change online, signing petitions, going to protests, or even just calling out brands on social media and just putting the pressure on those in charge to create change. Again, it all goes back to our collective power as consumers, withholding profits from brands, since that seems to be the only thing they care about. So yeah, if you feel inspired by this video, then have a look in the description, because I'm going to be posting some petitions and campaigns going on right now to call out brands. You can share this with people you think will be interested so that they can also learn about the power of collective boycotting and also be informed about what the fashion industry is trying to do. And yeah, as I said, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, because I talk about this stuff a lot, so you can get little reminders and updates that way too. But thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely day. Bye.